understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How you doing there? It is time for the podcast. John and I are exchanging stories about our bad Neds. The bag, as the brother said, the bag is out of order. Couldn't look at an egg in the morning.
The
Poor old brother. Anyway, we're going to talk about Nobel Prizes, John.
Yes,
Nobel
indeed.
Prizes for economics, because this week the Nobel Prize for economics has been announced, and not one economist but three. It's almost like
Three for the price of one.
It's like St. Patrick. It's like the Shamrock approach. God the Father, God the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
But all these fellas work together though, didn't they?
They do. So just so you know, Darren Acemoglu, who's Turkish, Simon Johnson and James Robinson, both English economists, but based in the United States. They all work in and around MIT, Harvard, that part, like the brainy part of America.
Yes,
You know,
the
big brainy part of America, where all the brainy people live, right? And they have won it for their work on development. Now, I think this will be, to the extent that rows within the economics fraternity, John, are newsworthy, I think there will be quite a significant backlash in economics against this particular decision, simply because what they have got the Nobel Prize for seems like a paean, let's say, or a herald, or even a love affair to the bourgeoisie.
Okay.
It's bourgeois economics.
Explain
As I call it centrist dad economics, right?
Right, okay.
So basically,
We're centrist dads, aren't we?
I know, but
Yeah.
there's always a backlash against us.
Well, true.
Exactly. So the basic book that inspired this decision was a book called Why Nations Fail: The Origins of Power, Prosperity and Poverty by Robinson and Acemoglu. And there was a certain other book written about 3 years ago by Acemoglu and the other guy,
Yeah.
Johnson, which is about progress and poverty as
Right.
well. But both books tend to take the very Eurocentric view that we can kind of, in effect, cut and paste what happened to Europe since the British Enlightenment, okay? So the Glorious Revolution that the Brits call it, which was the period about the end of the 17th century into the early 18th century,
Right.
characterized by friends like John Law,
Yeah.
and of course Samuel Pepys and all these
Yeah.
geezers, right? And they called it the Glorious Revolution simply because it was the period where the Dutch had a sort of a coup d'etat
Yeah.
in England, and William of Orange came over.
But what do you mean cut and paste?
So what they're saying is, in effect, if you look at why Britain, let's say, or Europe got wealthy, and you simply cut and paste that model onto the rest of the world, you will guarantee, in effect, the inequality in the world will ameliorate and poor countries will get rich.
I'm not sure if I follow it.
I know. Okay, so the biggest question in economics has to be in macroeconomics.
Yeah.
Why are some societies democratic, prosperous, and stable, and other societies are autocratic, poor, and unstable? That, I suppose, is the big question, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Why do countries accelerate? Why do countries decelerate? Why do countries, in effect, fail? And why do some countries succeed? And that is at the core of most macroeconomic thinking, particularly with respect to development economics, right?
Okay.
So how does Africa get rich? How did Ireland get rich? Are there any lessons for the rest of the world in what we have done?
Right.
How did Britain get rich? What was the Industrial Revolution about? Can it be replicated? How did China get rich? Why did the East Asian model of economic growth differ profoundly from Western models? So most East Asian countries, probably I would say the most successful economy in the world, bar none, is South Korea,
Right.
in terms of where it has come from and its trajectory. So South Korea had the same GDP per head as Mali in the 1960s.
Yeah.
And it is now one of the richest economies in the world. But more interestingly, it's a net exporter of, I'm going to say something really weird here, boy bands.
Right.
I think exporting boy bands is an exporting culture, is what I mean, like K-pop. Exporting. So the Koreans don't just export Hyundais and mobile phones.
Yeah.
They export their culture. They export, many Korean movies have won Oscars.
Yeah, well,
recently.
that's a
Loads
recent
of them,
thing.
right?
And also food as well, actually, is
Food,
very trendy these days.
Korean food, Korean movies, K-pop,
Yeah.
Huge phenomenon.
But they were already wealthy before they started exporting that.
This is, and of course, boy bands, right?
Yeah.
And this is what happens when countries get rich, that they stop exporting just manufacturing goods and they start exporting their culture.
Right.
And the great
okay.
example of that is the United States.
Yeah.
The United States,
Okay.
United States culture gives it power. Rock and roll, Hollywood, all that sort of stuff. And the image of the United States, whether you like it or not, has been created in Hollywood and has been subsequently exported.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. So once you see an Asian country exporting its culture, not just to Asia, but around the world, you think, okay, those guys have figured it all out.
Yeah.
They've also got immensely wealthy. They are very democratic. They are not particularly unequal societies, the Korean society.
Yeah.
And it's a society that's constantly under threat by its neighbor. Like, so don't underestimate that either.
Yeah.
You know, it's a society which needs to be really on its toes all the time.
Yeah.
But
It's quite hierarchical, though, as well.
it's a hierarchical society, like a lot of Asian societies.
Yeah.
But what is fascinating about Korea and all the Asian economies is they all grew under the thumb of the government. So they didn't grow. This is what Ha-Chun Chang, you know, the Korean economist, he's got that great book called 27 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism.
Yes.
It's a great book,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
He's also got a fantastic book called Edible Economics, which is about food and
Yeah.
economics. So really interesting guy. But he makes the point that Korea grew because the state picked winners. And that original state development in the 70s and 80s needed to be protected by protectionism, needed to be encouraged by the state, and resources need to be diverted into big industries. And that's how they grew their industries,
Yeah.
right? That is completely at odds with what these guys have said about how countries develop.
Why, what are they saying?
So they are basically saying that what you really need is institutions, right? You need stable, strong, transparent institutions.
Yeah.
And if you get that, so the rule of law, the currency, all these things, the tax system, all these things working, the political system not being corrupt, all the things you kind of know are helpful.
Yeah.
But what they have concluded is you kind of, everything else falls into place after that, which is why I call it the centrist dad thing. It's almost like, so don't give lip to the teacher approach to economics. Be a good boy and everything will come to you in time.
Yeah.
Now, Marxists would say, hold on a second. This is a very, very facile understanding of what has happened over the last 200 years, where we, and I describe Ireland as part of the colonist group, right? Even though we were a colony, we look, and we probably don't sound like colonists. We probably don't think like colonists, but we're from Northwest Europe, right?
Yeah.
So basically,
we're part of the system.
So these guys are saying, once the institutions are fine, everything's going to be hunky-dory.
Okay.
But that doesn't strike me as enough, right? So you take a book like Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs and Steel. I don't know if you read that years ago.
Yeah.
Wonderful book. And you'd love it because it's biology and it's history and it's talks about climate and all this sort of stuff. That seems to me to be a much more persuasive explainer of how we got to a situation where a country like Burundi and a country like Luxembourg have differences in GDP per head that run into the hundreds of percent differences,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Why did that happen? And other economists would say climate is very important. Culture, deep culture is very, very important. Were you or were you not a colony is extremely important. Think that the Europeans colonized most of the world. And profoundly changed the way in which people saw themselves.
Yeah.
Profoundly changed the way in which Europe enriched itself, Europe and America.
Yeah.
And ultimately has remained part of people's intellectual, commercial, and I think business baggage for a long, long time. You can see it in Ireland as well.
So they're just saying, as long as you have strong, inclusive institutions, everything will be hunky-dory. Everything else would fall into place.
Well, what they do is, in fairness, they take, for example, North versus South Korea.
Yeah.
Same people, totally different institutional setup. One country is amazingly rich. One country is incredibly poor. So they say it can't be climate, can't be culture, it has to be institutions.
Yeah.
It's
politics.
It's politics, right? And they start the book with the comparison between two towns. The town is called Noagles.
Yeah.
One Noagles is in Mexico,
Right.
and one Noagles is in America.
Okay.
Is in New Mexico.
Yeah.
And what they look at, they say, look, the American one is roughly 3 times as rich as the Mexican one, even though they are essentially both Mexican towns.
Yeah.
and in exactly the same part of the world, same culture, same climate, etc. And what they say is the American institutions are more robust.
But the American town also has access to
America.
a bigger market.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
right.
So geography counts.
Yeah.
Like it counts that Ireland is part of Europe. And it counted that Ireland was far away from the centres when we were actually not doing very well because capital flowed to the centre.
Yeah, yeah.
And of course, what our tax system has done is it's re-engineered that relationship by making capital very, very cheap to deploy here.
Right.
And therefore, we've changed that dynamic. But, you know, you're born in Afghanistan. It matters who your neighbours are.
Yeah.
You're born in Gaza. It matters who your neighbours are. You can't say to the Gazans, well, if you just put the rule of law in there, everything will be fine. They're getting killed,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
You know, it matters that Syria is beside Iraq. It matters that Islam or a certain violent form of Islam exists in certain places.
Yeah. But surely then this should be a warning to Americans not to vote for Trump, because Trump is all about, and has been the last time he was in, dismantling these institutions, the rule of law, the
Supreme Court, everything. Yeah.
So surely
Yeah,
that
but
in itself is a warning.
there's a sort of a nihilism in Trump voters, I think, who want to embrace chaos. I think this is why so many tech bros and bosses like Elon Musk have embraced Trump. Because I've been trying to get my head around it. Why would you do this, right? It's not just that he's going to make them rich, although that helps enormously, and he will make them much richer, and he will cut taxes on their dividends, and their this, that, the other. But I also think they live in a sort of an adolescent world of disruption where they think disruption is good, right?
Yeah.
You know, move fast and break things. You know, this sort of models. But in fact, societies don't like disruption. Societies like steady, predictable, decent, fair politicians. I should do. But I think a lot of people in America just want the chaos that Trump is promising.
Did you want to kind of
Tear it down.
And a blank slate? Let's start again.
Exactly. And the problem with this is that institutions, to come back to our topic, are inherited and they're cultivated over time and they improve iteratively, you know, a little bit at a time, and they become part of the overall culture of the society. And so to tell an African country, well, you can just cut and paste what the Irish did, and we take no cognizance of climate, of poverty, of geography, all these things. It seems to me to be a little bit simplistic.
So let me be clear here. Are you saying this is a bogus
It's
award?
not that it's it's a bogus award. It's fake news, John. It's fake news. No, what I'm saying is that it's when you come from a country like Ireland and you understand our economic and political history and you understand our relationship with our neighbour over years, and now new neighbours in the European Union. I call them new neighbours in terms of legally and institutionally.
Yeah.
I think you understand that shit things happen to countries. Okay?
Yeah.
Like you get occupied, you get the shit kicked out of you, you get over dependent on one crop, you starve.
Yeah.
The other crowd don't help you out, you starve more, and then you feck off to America. Right? I mean, this is the history of our country, and I think it's more representative of the history of most countries than you have a lovely revolution, you have the rule of law, you've got a big navy, it goes out, it kicks the lumps out of the locals, and you take all their money.
Yeah.
And you live happily ever after.
Yeah.
I think our representation of humanity is more representative of what is happening around the world.
Yeah.
And therefore, I think that many people are entitled to question whether or not such a narrow gauge approach to development should be rewarded with such an amazingly prestigious prize. That's all I'm saying. But why don't we go to the Caribbean and go to a proper developing country? Although you do, sometimes when I look at Ireland, you think, our institutions, Jesus, right? Let's go to Marla Dukaran. Let's talk development economics and let's talk about the Nobel Prize. We now have a very, very special guest, one of, I would say, the podcast's all-time favourite guests,
Indeed.
Marla Dukaran, and we are going to discuss the Nobel Prize for Economics, which was awarded this week to 3 development economists, okay? And we're going to talk about them. If you are interested in the work of these guys, there is a very interesting book published about 15 years ago, I'd say now, maybe 12 years ago, called Why Countries Fail. And that's the work of Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson. And the third guy who also got the Nobel Prize, Simon Johnson. Marla, let us talk about the economics here, because you're coming to Kilconomics. Probably the other serial offender at Kilconomics is Martin Lustow from Argentina, who comes every year. He has a different view about development than these guys. Can you explain to me what these three guys brought to the table, why they won the Nobel Prize, and what you think of it as somebody, A, from a developing country, and B, a development economist yourself?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, Martin and I had a big debate about that, and I understand his perspective coming from Latin America, where, their history and even the way their economies are structured is so much more complex than ours in the Caribbean, and they've been independent for so much longer. So I just want to preface everything I'm about to say with that context, that we come from very different places, if you know what I mean. Of course, we have to come every year to Kilconomics to represent the underachieving societies in the developing world, in the global south. But I think one of the things that this book, Why Do Nations Fail, what it left with me is this recognition that, and this is what the whole book talks about and gives evidence and various examples of, is the fact that institutions are fundamental to our development journey.
Now explain that to the listeners.
Right. And when you say institution, I think most people think of a big building like a central bank or a tax authority or a Supreme Court. Institutions are all of those things, but institutions are also your neighborhood watch, your school PTA, your football club. All of these are institutions, right? And therefore, what are institutions? It's people. It's people around a particular goal or particular guidelines and laws. Why are we here? Why are we forming? Why are we coming together? We're coming together to achieve some objective.
Yeah.
Whether it's we want to win the other school's football competition, we want to have a safer neighborhood, we want to have a stable currency. We all come together as people to achieve something. Now, what they were talking about was the fact that you have institutions that are based on what kind of, and which is what resonated with me, what kind of colony were you? So we were all colonized. Yes. Ireland was colonized, the whole of the Caribbean. Actually, the Caribbean is still mostly a colonized region by territory. We're only 44% independent.
Really?
By jurisdiction. Yep. Out of the 36, I think it's 36 territories we have, we're still mostly colonized by the Dutch, French, English, and of course the US that has a couple of territories as well here. And so when you think about our institutional makeup, it was all extractive. Even though, they like to say that there were some colonies that were settler colonies, the way the United States was. In fact, it was not. It was all about extracting wealth, extracting value, and sending it back to Europe more often than not. Right. And so our institutions, meaning our tax authority, our judicial system, our government system, our schools, our churches, everything was set up around this goal of extraction and sending back. And I mean, most of us have been independent for those of us who are independent have been independent for about, anywhere between 50 and 60 years. And so that's not such a long time. What we should have been doing during those 5 or 6 decades is reforming our institutions, recognizing that they were extractive. And we haven't done a good job of that. And so that's why we are still facing a lot of the issues that we inherited, upon independence, like poverty, like inequality, like corruption, like, all of those things. And I think I agree with the authors that your institutions are fundamental and a huge explanatory factor in terms of what your development trajectory looks like.
But these sort of, no, I'm with you. And I think many Irish listeners will have recognized that sort of post-colonial period that it takes to get over and to create your own institutions. Mm-hmm. And I think economists might call what you're talking about kind of social capital, the networks that bind people together. Mm-hmm. But I find it unusual that a Nobel Prize would be given for such a narrow understanding or explanation of why countries fail. So it doesn't say anything about geography. It doesn't say anything about climate. It doesn't say anything about culture, like deep, deep culture. It just says, look, if you got good property rights and you've a really fairly robust set of institutions, you'll be fine. And you bolster all this by a vibrant democracy that upholds the people's side of the bargain. A lot of development economists would say that's not enough. That doesn't explain why we are seeing extraordinary levels of inequality around the world.
I think all of those factors are important. Geography, of course, is very important, David. But look at us. We're in the Caribbean, sandwiched between north and south and east and west. And you would think that and we have great weather, nice people. So we have all those building blocks of being
social capital.
Right. But yet still, because of our institutional makeup, we are underperforming. Now, I just want to give an example of a country in the Caribbean that has undergone in the past decade to 12 years significant institutional reform, which we had a whole show on in your last Kilkenomics last year when Derek Jones, who's a Jamaican, came and we sat down and chatted about the miracle of Jamaica and how much Jamaica has. Right now, Jamaica does not have enough labor. They don't have enough people.
Which is kind of extraordinary when you think about it now.
It's crazy. They still have massive brain drain of people leaving, which they need to reverse. But Jamaica is seeing its lowest unemployment, lowest poverty rates ever. And I was in Kingston about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and you can feel the optimism. It's palpable. The optimism, the positivity, the progress. You can feel it, you can see it. And I'm not saying all of that to say that they are completely out of the woods. Of course, they still have a lot of social challenges. Crime is a big problem. The homicide rate is still very high, et cetera, et cetera. But the progress Jamaica has made in the past 10 years, nobody else in the Caribbean has ever seen that kind of progress in that space of time. And they did it. And this is why what this book said and why what these authors said resonates with me is that what Jamaica did was they reformed their institutions to make them less extractive and to make them more relevant to today's society as opposed to 100 years ago. So one of the biggest things that they did was they created this new institution. Well, they don't call it an institution, but to me it is, called the EPOC, the Economic Program Oversight Committee. And this was when they were entering their IMF program. This is a committee that consists of, various NGOs and private sector, public sector, sort of everybody, that takes the government's agenda, especially its legislative agenda and policy agenda, and holds them to account every quarter. What have you done? In other words, it's a scorecard.
Yeah.
And they go publicly. The president of the EPOC, Keith Duncan, he goes on the corner and the rum shop every quarter on live TV and says, well, this is what they said they were going to do. This is what was actually achieved. This is what we're now targeting in the next quarter, et cetera, et cetera. And that institution itself, I credit with bringing accountability and therefore bringing results to Jamaica's socioeconomic development story in the past 12 years. And again, it's because this is a new institution that they created to hold the government to account, to do the things that the hard work that it's supposed to do.
And they're going to have possibly the first Jamaican American female president very soon in Kamala Harris, because her dad was a very famous Jamaican economist. And development economist. And a Marxist development economist. And it's the Marxists that don't, I think, like this book because, in a sense, this book is kind of the victory for the centrist dad, right? It's like, just be sensible, right? Just do your homework and everything will be fine, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It's like not too much sexiness, yeah.
No, yeah. But, a lot of development economists will say, no, it's not just sufficient to have that. Yes, we have an example of Jamaica. Yes, it's turning the corner. And isn't this great? But the reason certain countries lag behind has got a whole host of other things. Because if these guys are right, the NGOs are out of business.
I guess you can say, well, not really. Because if you look at the EPOC in Jamaica, it is in itself an NGO. But I see what you mean. The development banks, basically.
The development bank, all these various different aid agencies, etc. I mean, in a way, they are very threatened by the fact that the Nobel Prize, if it is important, and I think it is significant, right, is given to 3 economists who kind of say, look, leave well alone, figure property rights out, get these institutions up and running, and everything will be hunky-dory.
Yeah, except that it's much broader than property rights, much, much broader. The institutions that we require for development. I mean, I think property is one of the very important ones, but even just healthcare, just plain old healthcare and basic education. Those are some of the most fundamental things. And as Amartya Sen said, and I love, the context in which he framed development. Development is freedom. For example, if you, in my country in Trinidad, you've been to Trinidad, David, and I pulled all my hair out when I heard that you went taking a walk in Port of Spain in the middle of the day because it's not safe. And so, but the thing is, if you don't have an institutional construct of law and order and the judiciary works, which we don't have in Trinidad, then what else can really function properly? Nothing. You can't take a walk.
Do you remember the text you said to me? I said, I'm going for a walk. And the text just came back and it was, you too white. That was it. It was delivered in a Trini accent in the text. And I'm like, oh, really? Yes! You're not even white, you're pink.
Marla, can I ask you a question about EPOC? Mm-hmm. Who are the people who run EPOC? Like, who are the individuals? They're obviously not politicians or coming from the same kind of bank.
Yes, I mean when it was originally so I did I waited for years to interview Keith Duncan, who is the president of EPOC. He's the head of Jamaica's most loved bank, JMMB Bank. And
can you have a most loved bank?
Yeah, that's an oxymoron, surely.
It was listen, y'all. We know how to do this. It is the most loved bank, and it was formed by his mother, if my memory serves me correct. And so it was a family-run bank. Now, so when the EPOC was first constituted, I think the membership of it and the way it was constituted was much more inclusive. So you had sort of the development banks, the IMF and the World Bank, and you had private sector. So you had sort of your Chamber of Commerce, and you had public sector representation, as well as, I think they had opposition as well. So it was really broadly constituted to sort of represent all the major stakeholder groups in the economy. I think it's a bit narrower now, but you get the point. It is an independent institution that holds government to account.
So it's not like a regular Quango that we would have here if the equivalent was here.
Here you'd have Mick and Joe would get a job, and Mick's cousin.
And whoever is a retiring politician would get a nice gig for the last few years. And
a couple of yes-man professors who give it an academic tint, but all they say is yes. Anyway, but let us come back to the development idea before we go, okay? Because it just struck me that one of the flaws, if you will, in this thinking is that they tend to look at the world as a potential replica of this part of the world, how this part of the world grew and how this part of the world prospered. And as we know, it prospered for many reasons. One of them was colonialism. We were extracting...
Colonialism,
we were the first colony. But the essential model was exactly the same. You take value. I mean, the role of the colonizer is to rob the colony. That's what it's all about. It's not about anything else.
100%.
So how do we look at, for example, African countries now who need to grow as quickly, if not quicker, than Caribbean countries? And they haven't done so thus far. What sort of blueprint do we give them based on these 3 guys who've just won the Nobel Prize?
I think bottom line in countries like ours, where we were heavily extractive, and you can tell me from Ireland's experience, I think one of the first things we need to get right is to fix that extractive bias or predisposition that we have, where you extract, and if it's not going back to a colonizer, but it's going to the elite. And so when you look at how inequality statistics have moved as well over time globally, but in even the inequality within countries is actually higher than the inequality across countries,
Yes.
right? According to the data. And so that alone tells you that extractive nature of our institutions is what has driven that inequality, because you're sending it to the elite as opposed to the colonizer. I think that's the first thing we need to fix. And your country would probably be a good example of that journey. I know Singapore has been as well, in terms of how they've addressed that extractive nature of the institutional framework that then drove inequality. Because in Singapore, they're one of the least unequal countries in the developed world, right? So I think that, to me, it's fundamental. And I agree with what these authors, years ago, I read this book and it just, all kinds of lights went off in my head. And I'm glad that they were rewarded for this work. And I think that the example of Jamaica, it validates this notion that our institutions are fundamental to our development journey.
It's funny, Irish people will realize we got rich despite our institutions.
Yes. Yes, that's true.
It's true. It's actually true.
But your tax policy was decided by an institution, which is a big part of why Ireland has attracted capital and attracted growth the way that it has in the last couple of decades, right?
Fair point. That is a fair point.
Mm-hmm.
That is a fair point. It's just we're coming into an election. You will be in Kilkenny in 3 weeks' time. Chances are an election will be had in America. That'll definitely have happened.
Yes.
And they're just about to have in Ireland. So you will see Irish canvassing, local canvassing, which is a sight to behold.
I can't wait.
There isn't, if you think there are no votes in potholes, you will see. There will be fellas promising paved roads from people's back gardens to their kids' schools before the end of the next government. This is how it works here.
Yeah, same here in the Caribbean. Some things don't change in the colonies, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, Marlon, so that was brilliant to see you, as always, and I'll see you in the flesh in a couple of weeks' time.
Can't wait. Cheers, guys.
Brilliant to have Marla on again. And of course, she's going to be down in Kilconomics.
Yeah, talking development.
Yeah. But come here, I was just reading there before we started this, that the richest 20% of the world's countries are now 30 times richer than the poorest 20%.
Yeah, it's phenomenal.
And when you talk about that in this context, you know, the Nobel Prize and the institutions and all that kind of stuff, you can't help but thinking that this growing wealth gap gives rise to all sorts of problems, but mainly migration. People get up and leave, going on.
I'm not hanging out here.
Yeah, I'm not staying being poor. I want to get moving. And of course, that's causing so many problems here in Europe, in particular in America. So if you kind of solve that wealth gap to a large extent,
You solve everything.
you solve absolutely everything.
I mean, it is fascinating. That inequality is extraordinary, particularly when you look at it historically. That level of inequality is quite unusual. So if you go back to the pre-colonizing times, right, it's estimated that the average Aztec in Mexico, or what became Mexico, had an income of about half below the average conquistador.
Okay.
So in terms of their lifestyle, in terms of their diet, in terms of their longevity, in terms of disease, all these things, right? The Spaniards were about twice as rich. So it wasn't that the Spaniards arrived in America with this massive economic heft. They had technological heft. And this is what Jared Diamond talks about in his book. They had the germs, they had the guns, they had the steel. But in terms of actually economic welfare, there wasn't anything like, for example, what you just articulated, like a 30.
Right, okay.
Right? So that's interesting. So it's inequality is a product of many things. Taking over people's countries being one of them, right? The second thing is, you're absolutely right, that if we were to solve, or if over time countries became less unequal, so if over time Ireland was less attractive to people because their own lives were more attractive, then you'd obviously solve migration. That the reason Irish people went to America in our millions is because this place was a hole.
Yeah.
It was a terrible place.
Yeah.
And we got letters from our mates who had just gone to America who said, come on over here. The streets are paved with gold.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, yeah.
Even though they weren't.
Yeah.
But immigrants always tell themselves a great story. That's one of the odd. And you even notice if you were pretty much down in the dumps in London when you were a young fella, you never came home and said London's brutal.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you always, it's great. I'm flying.
Yeah.
flying me, doing great stuff. You're actually sitting around watching Netflix all day. So are the 1990s equivalent of
Yes,
that, right?
yeah.
So, but let's get to the point. I think what you find is in order to, for example, think about African inequality and wealth disparity and whatever, there's a huge movement that says, we need an African martial aid. And they go back to this idea that the Americans came in after the Second World War. They had a plan for Europe. It involved a huge amount of subsidies from America for Europeans. They built the Europeans up. And then 10 or 20 years later, they were off you go. You're on your Todd now. And what a lot of people say, look, we should have something similar for Africa, like big aid. These guys are saying no, that unless you get the institutions right, if you push money into African countries, for example, or any poor country, it will only exacerbate the problem because the extractive people that Marta talked about will still be at the top.
Yeah.
And they'll take all the aid money as well.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's a lot of evidence that that happened in Africa, certainly in the 70s, 80s and 90s. And there was a very interesting book written about it called Dead Aid by an African economist called Dambisa Moyo. I think she was from Zambia. And she was just making the point that the more aid you give, the more handouts they seek. This was her idea. Very much informed by American neocon thinking.
Yes.
On welfareism. You know, they say, well, there's a welfare this. But what these guys are saying is that the substantial truth of development is you get these institutions right, as Marta was talking about Jamaica, and good things follow. What you're saying, though, is they mightn't follow quickly enough. And the time it takes to turn a country around is a lifetime.
Yeah.
And that's all people have. So they're saying, you know what, I'll take my chances in America or in Ireland or in Europe next year, rather than wait for the economy to respond to all these reforms that in 20 or 30 years' time will deliver some economic growth. Most people don't have that time. They don't have the luxury.
Yeah.
And the one thing we always talked about poverty is that poor people have immediate time horizons and rich people can plan, because poor people need the money today. They don't have the luxury of saying, oh, I think I'll go to university and then I'll postpone this thing. That one of the ways to look at development is that when you're poor, the future is obliterated because everything is about the immediate getting through today. And when you're rich, your future is extended because everything is about how do I set myself up for more prosperity in the end, given that I don't really need to worry about it now.
Yeah.
And that's the nub of your argument, which is that it takes too long. And in that interim, particularly in very populous countries, the young fellas are just leaving and they're coming here.